I just want to start with a disclaimer. As we're watching through this video of this reenactment, and you're getting to hear me talk about the history, and what I'm going to read is the history of the Battle of Princeton. The fundamental aspects and the most unique position that New Jersey played in this Battle of Princeton that started in Trenton, ended in Princeton, to shaping the United States. Something that we could all think about is New Jersey. Its side name is referenced as the Garden State. Gardens, if you go from tip to tip in New Jersey, you can end up finding different stages of a plant's growth, from nothing to farmland, sometimes it's depending on the time of year, beer farmland, all the way up to full cities now in 2026. Let's just get into it and let's begin. Let's begin with the introduction. And the Battle of Princeton is not just about the Revolutionary War and the turning point that now of what we know now as the United States of America. Just standing out here for a couple hours, I was able to appreciate much more, and I'm sure hopefully you can understand as well the amount of time and weather and the walking that these soldiers did to help, and they did not know what they were actually gonna actually make happen, but what they were hoping for was to make change. And that's a tremendous thing in itself, to give up the sacrifices that they gave. It's just amazing. And let's go. It's time to start. The Battle of Princeton stands as one of the most pivotal engagements of the American Revolutionary War. A brilliant tactical victory that transformed the fortunes of the Continental Army and breathed new life into the faltering cause of American independence. Fought on January 3rd, 1777, in the frozen fields surrounding Princeton, New Jersey, this battle represented the culmination of George Washington's audacious 10-day campaign that would forever alter the trajectory of the war. Coming on the heels of the stunning Christmas night victory at Trenton, Princeton demonstrated that the Continental Army was not merely a ragtag collection of farmers and merchants, but a fighting force capable of outmaneuvering and defeating the professional soldiers of the British Empire. The significance of Princeton cannot be overstated. In the dark winter of 1776 to 1777, the American cause seemed all but lost. The Continental Army had suffered a series of devastating defeats in New York, retreating across New Jersey in disarray as enlistments expired and soldiers deserted in droves. British and Hessian forces occupied much of New Jersey, and many colonists who had initially supported independence were taking oaths of loyalty to the crown. The Declaration of Independence, signed just 6 months earlier, appeared to be nothing more than a futile gesture of defiance. It was in this desperate context that Washington conceived and executed one of the most daring military campaigns in American history, culminating in the Battle of Princeton. To understand the Battle of Princeton, one must first comprehend the dire circumstances facing the Continental Army in the final weeks of 1776. The year had begun with such promise. The British evacuation of Boston in March had seemed to vindicate the American cause. However, the subsequent campaign for New York had proven catastrophic for Washington and his army. Beginning in August 1776, British General William Howe, supported by his brother Admiral Richard Howe's powerful fleet, had systematically defeated Washington's forces in a series of engagements, including the Battle of Long Island. the landing at Kips Bay, and the Battle of White Plains. By late November 1776, Washington had been forced to abandon New York entirely, retreating across New Jersey with the British in pursuit. The Continental Army was hemorrhaging soldiers through desertion, capture, and the expiration of enlistments. From a force that had numbered over 20,000 men in the summer, Washington's army had dwindled to fewer than 3,000 effective troops by early December. The British commander, General Howe, established a chain of outposts across New Jersey, stretching from New Brunswick to Bordentown, with significant garrisons at Trenton and Princeton. Howe then retired to the comfort of New York City for the winter, confident that the rebellion would collapse before spring. The British strategy was predicated on the assumption that 18th century warfare followed certain gentlemanly conventions. Armies did not campaign in winter, and the war would resume in the spring when weather permitted. This assumption would prove to be a fatal miscalculation. Washington, desperate to achieve some success before the enlistments of most of his army expired on December 31st, 1776, began planning an audacious strike against the Hessian garrison at Trenton. The Hessians were German mercenaries hired by the British Crown, and their presence in New Jersey had been marked by harsh treatment of the civilian population, creating resentment among the colonists. What strikes me the most here is this is 1776, and there's Germans involved in the turning point of the United States. Just something to food for thought. On Christmas night, 1776, Washington executed one of the most famous military operations in American history, leading approximately 2,400 men across the ice-choked Delaware River in a howling winter storm. Washington's force marched 9 miles through sleet and snow to launch a surprise dawn attack on the Hessian garrison at Trenton. The attack was a stunning success. The Continental Army killed or wounded over 100 Hessians and captured nearly 900 more, along with valuable supplies and artillery. While suffering only 4 wounded, 2 of them later died from exposure during the march. The victory at Trenton electrified the American cause. News of the triumph spread rapidly throughout the colonies, reinvigorating support for independence and encouraging soldiers to re-enlist. However, Washington understood that one victory was not enough. The British would respond forcefully, and he needed to capitalize on his success before the enemy could recover. After briefly returning to Pennsylvania with his prisoners and captured supplies, Washington made the bold decision to recross the Delaware and reoccupy Trenton on December 30th, 1776. This decision was fraught with risk. Washington's army was still small and poorly equipped, and he was positioning himself between 2 British forces, Lord Cornwallis's army advancing from Princeton and Colonel von Donop's Hessians at Bordentown. However, Washington had received reinforcements, including militia units and Continental troops whose enlistments he had convinced to extend, bringing his force to approximately 5,000 men. He established a defensive position along the Assunpink Creek just south of Trenton and prepared for the British response. There are actually 2 battles that happened in Trenton and led into the Battle of Princeton. Lord Charles Cornwallis, one of Britain's most capable generals, was in Princeton preparing to sail to England when news of the Trenton defeat reached him. Immediately cancelling his voyage, Cornwallis assembled a force of approximately 8,000 British and Hessian troops and marched toward Trenton on January 2nd, 1777. His intention was to trap Washington's army against the Delaware River and destroy it once and for all. Throughout January 2nd, American forces, under the command of officers including Colonel Edward Hand, conducted a masterful delaying action, slowing Cornwallis's advance with skirmishes and obstacles. This fighting retreat bought Washington precious time to prepare his defenses along the Assunpink Creek. When Cornwallis finally arrived at Trenton late in the afternoon, he launched several probing attacks against the American positions, all of which were repulsed with his significant British casualties. As darkness fell, Cornwallis made a fateful decision. Rather than press the attack, he would wait until morning to bag the facts, as he reportedly told his officers. This decision gave Washington the opportunity he needed. That night, in one of the most remarkable councils of war in military history, Washington and his officers conceived a plan of breathtaking audacity. Rather than retreat across the Delaware or await the inevitable British assault in the morning, they would execute a night march around Cornwallis' left flank, strike at the British supply base and garrison at Princeton, and then advance toward the main British supply depot at New Brunswick. If successful, this maneuver would not only allow Washington to escape the trap, but would also threaten the entire British position in New Jersey. The execution of this plan required extraordinary coordination and discipline. To deceive the British, Washington ordered his men to keep their campfires burning and detailed a small force to make noise and continue work on the defensive fortifications, creating the impression that the American army remained in position. Meanwhile, the main body of the Continental Army, approximately 4,500 men with their artillery, began a silent march at 1 a.m. on January 3, 1777. The route took them along a little-used back road, now known as Quaker Road, that led northeast toward Princeton. The night march was a grueling ordeal. The temperature had dropped below freezing, and the roads, which had been muddy from the previous day's thaw, had frozen into deep ruts that made movement difficult for both men and artillery. The soldiers wrapped their wagon wheels and horses' hooves in cloth to muffle the sound. Many of the men were still inadequately clothed and shod, and the march left a trail of bloody footprints in the frozen ground. Despite these hardships, the army maintained remarkable discipline, moving in near-complete silence through the darkness. As dawn broke on January 3, 1777, Washington's army was approaching Princeton from the south. The general divided his force into two columns. The main body, under Washington's personal command, would continue along the Quaker Road and approach Princeton from the southeast. A smaller force, under General Hugh Mercer, consisting of approximately 350 Continental soldiers, was detached to destroy the bridge over Stony Brook on the main road between Princeton and Trenton, thereby preventing British reinforcements from reaching Princeton or Cornwallis from retreating back to his supply base. Princeton at this time was a small college town, home to the College of New Jersey, now Princeton University. Fascinating piece of history in itself, which had been founded in 1746. The town's strategic importance lay in its position on the main road between New York and Philadelphia, and its role as a supply depot for British forces in New Jersey. The British garrison at Princeton consisted of 3 regiments: the 17th Regiment of Foot, the 40th Regiment of Foot, and the 55th Regiment of Foot, totaling approximately 1,200 men under the overall command of Lieutenant Colonel Charles Mahood. On the morning of January 3rd, Mahood was preparing to march with the 17th and 55th Regiments to reinforce Cornwallis at Trenton, leaving the 40th Regiment to guard Princeton. As Mahood's column marched south on the main road, they spotted Mercer's detachment moving to destroy the bridge. Both commanders immediately recognized the significance of the encounter. Mercer understood that British troops were leaving Princeton, potentially complicating Washington's attack, while Mahood realized that American forces were in the area, though he initially believed them to be only a small raiding party. This is where the 2-hour Battle of Princeton actually began. The initial engagement of the Battle of Princeton occurred in an orchard on the farm of William Clark, located between the main road and Stony Brook. Around 8 a.m., Mercer's force and Mahood's 17th Regiment spotted each other nearly simultaneously. Both commanders ordered their men to race for the high ground of the orchard, recognizing its tactical importance. The British, being closer and moving on the road, reached the position first and quickly formed a battle line. General Hugh Mercer was a Scottish-born physician and soldier who had fought with Bonnie Prince Charlie at Culloden before immigrating to America. He was a close friend of Washington and an experienced officer. Recognizing that he was outnumbered and the British had seized the advantageous position, Mercer nevertheless ordered his men to form a line and engage the enemy. The two forces, separated by only about 40 yards, opened fire on each other in the classic linear warfare style of the 18th century. The firefight was intense but brief. The Continental soldiers, many of whom where militia with limited training began to waver under the disciplined volleys of the British regulars. When Mahood ordered a bayonet charge, the American line broke. 18th century muskets were not equipped with bayonets as a standard issue for militia, and the sight of British regulars charging with fixed bayonets was terrifying to inexperienced troops. Mercer's men began to retreat in disorder. General Mercer, attempting to rally his troops, had his horse shot from under him. Rising to his feet, he continued to encourage his men to stand and fight. The British soldiers, in the heat of battle, and perhaps mistaking Mercer for Washington, both men were mounted officers in similar uniforms, surrounded him. When Mercer refused to surrender, he was bayoneted multiple times. Accounts vary, but he received at least 7 bayonet wounds. Left for dead on the field, Mercer would linger for 9 days before succumbing to his injuries, becoming one of the most celebrated martyrs of the Revolution. At this point, Washington had to take command. The rout of Mercer's detachment created a critical moment in the battle. The fleeing American soldiers ran directly into a brigade of Pennsylvania militia under General John Cadwalader that was advancing to support Mercer. The sight of Continental regulars fleeing in a panic threatened to trigger a general collapse of the American attack. The Pennsylvania militia, already nervous about facing British regulars, began to waver. It was at this moment that George Washington demonstrated the leadership qualities that would make him legendary, riding forward with his staff and his lifeguard and his personal bodyguard. Washington personally rallied the retreating troops. Contemporary accounts describe Washington riding directly into the midst of the confusion mass of soldiers. His presence alone beginning to steady the men, he ordered Cadwalader's Pennsylvanians to form a line and brought up additional Continental regiments under Colonel Daniel Hitchcock and Colonel Edward Hand. The situation remained desperate. Mahood's 17th Regiment, flushed with their initial success, was advancing confidently, and the 55th Regiment was moving to support them. Washington needed to stabilize his line and bring his superior numbers to bear before the British could consolidate their advantage. In one of the most iconic moments of the Revolution, Washington personally led the reformed American line forward to within 30 yards of the British position. What happened next has been described by numerous eyewitnesses and has become part of the American military legend. Washington, mounted on his white horse, positioned himself between the two lines as they prepared to fire. His aides, including Colonel John Fitzgerald, reportedly covered their eyes, unable to watch what they believed would be the death of their commander. At Washington's command, both lines fired simultaneously at point-blank range. The volley created a cloud of smoke so thick that for several seconds, Fitzgerald could not see whether Washington had survived. When the smoke cleared, Washington sat unharmed on his horse, waving his hat and shouting encouragement to his men. The American volley had been devastating to the British line, and Washington immediately ordered his troops to charge. The combination of the effective volley and Washington's inspiring presence broke the British formation. Mahood's 17th Regiment, which had been so confident just minutes before, began to retreat in disorder. The battle itself on the fields started to change, but now there's a fight for Nassau Hall. The collapse of Mahood's force triggered a general British retreat. The 17th Regiment fell back toward the main road, attempting to maintain some order, while the 55th Regiment, which had not yet fully engaged, also began to withdraw. Mahood, demonstrating considerable personal courage and tactical skill, managed to extract a portion of his force and retreat toward Trenton, where he would eventually rejoin Cornwallis. However, many British soldiers were cut off from this retreat and fled toward Princeton itself. Meanwhile, the 40th Regiment of Foot, which had remained in Princeton as a garrison, found itself in an increasingly untenable position as the sounds of battle grew closer and fleeing soldiers from the 17th and 55th Regiments began arriving in town. The commander of the 40th realized that a substantial American force was approaching. Some of the British soldiers attempted to form a defensive position in the town, while others, along with many of the fleeing troops from the earlier engagement, took refuge in Nassau Hall, the main building of the College of New Jersey. Nassau Hall was a substantial stone structure, the largest academic building in the colonies at the time, and it offered a strong defensive position. Approximately 200 British soldiers barricaded themselves inside, preparing to hold out until relief could arrive from Cornwallis' army at Trenton. However, Washington was not about to allow a prolonged siege to develop. He brought up his artillery, including several of the guns captured at Trenton, and positioned them to fire on the building. Captain Alexander Hamilton, who would later become the first Secretary of the Treasury, commanded one of the artillery pieces. Hamilton's gun crew fired several rounds at Nassau Hall, with at least one cannonball reportedly passing through the building's chapel and decapitating a portrait of King George II that hung on the wall. The portrait was later replaced with one of George Washington. The artillery fire, combined with the threat of an infantry assault, convinced the British soldiers inside to surrender. The white flag appeared from Nassau Hall's windows, and approximately 200 British soldiers became prisoners of war. The aftermath of this battle. The Battle of Princeton was over by approximately 10 a.m., having lasted less than 2 hours from the first shots in the orchard to the surrender at Nassau Hall. The American victory was complete. The British had suffered approximately 100 kills, 70 wounded, and 280 captured. The American casualties were significantly lighter, with about 25 killed, including General Mercer, who would die of his wounds, and 40 wounded. More importantly, Washington had achieved his strategic objectives. He had defeated a British force, captured valuable supplies, and escaped the trap that Cornwallis had set at Trenton. However, Washington understood that his position remained precarious. Cornwallis, upon discovering that the American army had slipped away during the night, had immediately marched his 8,000-man force toward Princeton. Washington's exhausted army, which had been marching and fighting for over 30 hours with little rest, was in no condition to face Cornwallis' superior force. Washington briefly considered advancing to New Brunswick, where the British maintained their main supply depot, including a war chest reportedly containing $70,000 in gold. The capture of New Brunswick would have been a devastating blow to British operations in New Jersey. However, Washington's officers convinced him that the army was too exhausted to continue. Many soldiers were literally falling asleep on their feet, and the horses pulling the artillery were near collapse. Reluctantly, Washington ordered a withdrawal to the north, toward the hills around Morristown. As the Continental Army marched away from Princeton, they could see the advance elements of Cornwallis' force approaching from the south. It was a near-run thing. Had Cornwallis arrived even an hour earlier, the outcome might have been very different. The march to Morristown was another ordeal for the exhausted soldiers. Many men simply collapsed by the roadside, unable to continue. Washington later wrote that his army was absolutely unable to move further, and that many soldiers had gone without sleep for 50 hours. Nevertheless, by January 6th, 1777, the Continental Army had reached Morristown, where Washington established winter quarters in a strong defensive position in the Watchung Mountains. From this position, Washington could threaten British communications and supply lines while his army rested and recovered. It's time to conclude with this. The Battle of Princeton, fought on January 3rd, 1777, stands at a pivotal moment in the American Revolutionary War and in the broader history of the United States, coming at the end of a 10-day campaign that began with the crossing of the Delaware on Christmas night, 1776. Princeton represented the culmination of George Washington's audacious strategy to revive their American cause through aggressive action and bold risk-taking. The battle itself was a relatively small engagement by the standards of 18th century warfare. Fewer than 6,000 men were engaged on both sides, and the fighting lasted less than 2 hours. However, its impact was enormous. The victory at Princeton, combined with the earlier success at Trenton, transformed the strategic situation in New Jersey, revived American morale at a critical moment, and demonstrated that the Continental Army could defeat British regulars in open battle. The psychological and political effects of the Princeton campaign reverberated throughout the colonies and across the Atlantic, changing perceptions of the war and the likelihood of American success. From a military standpoint, Princeton showcased Washington's developing skills as a commander. His strategic vision, tactical flexibility, and personal courage were all on display. The night march around Cornwallis' flank was a masterpiece of operational art, while Washington's personal intervention at the crisis point of the battle demonstrated the importance of leadership at the tactical level. The battle also illustrated important principles of warfare: the value of surprise, the importance of intelligence and deception, the effectiveness of combined arms tactics, and the advantages of strategic mobility. The human dimension of the battle, the sacrifice of General Mercer, the endurance of the soldiers who marched through the frozen night, the courage of men on both sides who stood and fought in the face of musket fire and bayonet charges, reminds us that beyond the strategic analysis and tactical discussions were real people who risked and often gave their lives for causes they believed in. The legacy of Princeton extends far beyond the immediate military and political consequences. The battle became part of the founding mythology of the United States, a story that has been told and retold, commemorated and celebrated for nearly 2.5 centuries. It represents a moment when the American cause, which had seemed all but lost, was revived through determination, courage, and inspired leadership. The lessons of Princeton about the importance of perseverance in the face of adversity, the value of bold action, and the power of leadership remain relevant today. As we reflect on the Battle of Princeton from the perspective of more than 2 centuries, we can appreciate both its immediate significance and its enduring legacy. It was a turning point in the Revolutionary War, a demonstration of American military capability, and a defining moment in George Washington's career as a commander. More than that, it was a testament to the courage and determination of the men who fought for American independence, and it remains an inspiring example of how bold action at a critical moment can change the course of history. The frozen fields of Princeton, where American and British soldiers clashed on that January morning in 1777, witnessed events that would shape the future of a nation and influence the course of world history. The victory achieved there, against considerable odds and in the face of enormous challenges, helped to ensure that the American experiment in self-government would continue, that the Declaration of Independence would be more than just words on paper, and that the United States would have the opportunity to fulfill its promise as a beacon of liberty and democracy. For these reasons, the Battle of Princeton deserves to be remembered and studied, not just as a military engagement, but as a crucial moment in the birth of the American nation. And it happened in the state of New Jersey. Amazing in itself, and I thank each and every one of you for watching all the way up until this point, and I appreciate each and every one of you for watching, and I'm sure you're going to end up sharing this video as well. Let's together make a difference.